You have no idea how much damage you have caused to this family with your selfishness. Ryan has been patient for years, but your health scare was the final straw we needed to see the truth. We are done pretending that this marriage can work. You are not the woman he needs. Sign the papers tonight, Lauren. It is the only way to protect what little is left of our family's reputation and assets. If you refuse, you will regret it when the lawyers get involved and expose everything you have been hiding. Hi, my name is Lauren Hayes. I am 29 years old. Those words landed in the quiet hospital room like stones dropped into still water. I had just hung up with the nurse who told me the tests were clear, that the sharp pains and the fear were nothing more than stress and a minor inflammation. Relief should have flooded through me. Instead, my mother-in-law Barbara stood at the foot of the bed, holding a manila folder, her mouth set in that thin line she used when she had already decided how the rest of my life would go. My husband Ryan lingered near the window, staring at the parking lot as if the answer to everything was out there among the cars. I had met Ryan in college. We married at 24, both of us still figuring out what adulthood looked like. I worked as a senior financial analyst at a regional bank downtown. The job was steady, the hours long sometimes, but it gave me a quiet pride I rarely talked about. Ryan ran a small commercial real estate brokerage he had inherited from his uncle. On paper, we looked like any other couple in our late 20s trying to build something together. In reality, the cracks had been spreading for a while. Hairline fractures, I kept telling myself, were normal. The health scare began 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday night. I came home from work with a pain low in my abdomen that would not let up. Ryan was on a call in the kitchen. He glanced up, asked if I was okay, and went back to his conversation when I said I thought it was something I ate. By midnight, the pain was worse. I drove myself to the emergency room because he had an early meeting the next morning, and I did not want to bother him. The doctors ran tests, scheduled more tests, and told me to wait. In those waiting days, I learned how quickly a marriage can reveal its true weight. Ryan visited the hospital once. He brought flowers from the grocery store and stayed 20 minutes. My mother-in-law called every day, but her questions were never about how I felt. She asked whether I had updated my will, whether Ryan knew where all the accounts were, whether I had thought about what would happen to the family's plans if something went wrong. I brushed it off as her usual controlling style. I had learned years ago that arguing with Barbara only made her dig in harder. Jessica, my closest friend from college, who now worked in the trust administration at another bank, came to sit with me during one of the long waits between scans. She did not ask for details. She just brought coffee and sat. On the third day, she texted me a single line, "Call me when you can talk privately." I did not have the energy to ask what it was about. When the final test results came back benign, I felt the kind of tired relief that makes your bones heavy. I was already planning the text I would send Ryan when Barbara walked in carrying that folder. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not wait for Ryan to join the conversation. She simply opened the folder on the rolling tray table and slid a stack of papers toward me. The top page was a separation agreement. My name and Ryan's were already typed in. The financial disclosures listed assets I did not recognize and debts I had never seen. Barbara's voice stayed even, almost gentle, as she explained that Ryan needed to move forward without the constant worry my health had created. She said the family had discussed it, and everyone agreed this was the cleanest path. Ryan stayed by the window. He did not correct her. He did not look at me. I remember the way the hospital bracelet felt tight around my wrist. I remember the sound of the papers sliding across the plastic tray. I remember asking very quietly whether Ryan had read any of this before she brought it here. He answered without turning around. "It's for the best, Lauren. We can do this without making it ugly." Barbara's next sentence was the one that made the room feel smaller. She said that if I fought the separation, the family would have no choice but to protect Ryan's reputation in court. She said some things about my instability during the health scare and how it might look to a judge. The implication sat between us like smoke. I had spent 3 weeks terrified I was seriously ill, and now the people who were supposed to be my safety net were using that fear as leverage. I did not sign the papers. I asked them both to leave. Barbara gathered the folder with the same calm she had arrived with. Ryan followed her out without another word. The door clicked shut behind them, and the only sound left was the soft beep of a monitor that was no longer attached to me. I sat there for a long time after they left. The relief I should have felt about the clean test results had been replaced by something colder and clearer. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. Jessica's message from 2 days earlier was still there. I opened it again. She had written that she needed to talk privately. In the quiet of that room, I typed back 3 words. I'm ready now. She answered within minutes. Her text was short and careful. I pulled some records this morning after you mentioned Ryan's brokerage accounts. There are transfers I cannot explain. I think you need to see the file in person. She offered to meet me at her office the next day. She did not say the word betrayal. She did not have to. I checked myself out of the hospital that evening against medical advice. The nurse gave me the usual warnings about rest and follow-up. I nodded and signed the discharge papers with the same hand that had refused to touch Barbara's folder. On the drive home, the city lights blurred. I kept both hands on the wheel and tried not to think about the separation papers or the way Ryan had stood at the window like a stranger. When I pulled into our driveway, the house was dark. Ryan's car was not there. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before going inside. The silence of the rooms felt different now, as if the walls themselves had shifted while I was gone. I left the lights off and walked straight to the small desk in the corner of the living room where we kept the shared laptop. I opened it and typed in the password we had used for years. The screen lit up with the usual folders. Nothing looked out of place at first glance. I almost closed it again. Then I noticed a new folder labelled with a date from the week before my health scare started. I clicked it open. Inside were scanned statements from an account I had never seen on any of our joint paperwork. The balance was substantial. The name on the account was not ours. It was a trust in Barbara's name with Ryan listed as beneficiary. My hands went still on the keyboard. I stared at the screen until the numbers stopped making sense. Then I picked up my phone and called Jessica back. She answered on the first ring. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a moment, then said she would bring everything she had the next morning. Before she hung up, she added one more thing. Lauren, there's a letter too. It came to my office by mistake last month. I think it was meant for you. I didn't open it, but the return address is from Ryan's brokerage. I thanked her and ended the call. The house was still dark. I did not turn on any lights. I sat at the desk with the laptop screen as my only illumination and waited for morning. Somewhere in the quiet, I realized the health scare had not been the real crisis. The real crisis had been waiting for me to stop being afraid long enough to see what was already in front of me. The next morning, Jessica arrived at my door before 8, carrying a thick accordion file and 2 cups of coffee she had picked up on the way. She did not smile when I opened the door. She simply stepped inside, set the file on the kitchen counter, and waited while I poured the coffee into mugs. We sat at the small table where Ryan and I usually ate breakfast. The chair across from me felt emptier than it should have. Jessica opened the file without preamble. She slid the first page toward me, a bank statement from an account I had never seen. The name on it was a revocable trust. Barbara Hayes was the trustee. Ryan was the sole beneficiary. The balance was more than enough to explain why my mother-in-law had been so calm when she demanded I sign the separation papers. Jessica pointed to a series of transfers that had moved money out of Ryan's brokerage operating account over the past 18 months. The amounts were small enough to avoid notice on routine statements, but they added up. None of them appeared on any of the joint financial summaries Ryan had shown me when we filed taxes. I asked her how she had found it. She said one of the transfers had flagged an internal review at her bank because the receiving account shared an address with a property Ryan's brokerage had listed last year. She had pulled the public records out of habit and then cross-checked the names. When she saw Barbara's name linked to both the trust and the address, she stopped digging on her own and brought everything to me. Her voice stayed level, but her hands stayed wrapped tight around her mug. I read the next few pages in silence. The brokerage had reported steady but modest profits on our joint returns. The statements in front of me showed larger cash flows that had never made it to those returns. Some of the money had gone into the trust. Some had gone to pay for expenses that appeared on Barbara's credit cards. One wire had gone to a law firm I did not recognize. I asked Jessica what she thought it meant. She answered that it looked like Ryan had been moving money out of the business before it could be reported as income. She said if the IRS ever audited the brokerage, those transfers would be difficult to explain without additional documentation that did not seem to exist. My phone buzzed on the counter. Ryan's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. Jessica watched me but did not comment. When the phone went quiet, she asked whether I wanted her to stay while I looked through the rest. I told her I needed to read it alone first. She nodded, gathered her things, and said she would be at her office if I needed anything else. Before she left, she placed one more item on the table, a plain white envelope with my name typed on the front. She said it had arrived at her office the week before my health scare. The return address was the brokerage. She had not opened it. She left without waiting for me to thank her. I sat with the envelope for several minutes before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Ryan dated 2 weeks earlier. The tone was careful and distant, the kind of language people use when they have already decided something and are only pretending to discuss it. He wrote that the health scare had made him realize how much of his life had been put on hold. He said he still cared about me but could not keep living in a marriage that felt like it was waiting for the next crisis. He asked me to consider the separation papers his mother had brought as a way to make the transition easier for both of us. He ended by saying he would be staying at his parents' house for a few days while I got my bearings. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The handwriting was his, but the words felt like they had been shaped by someone else. I thought about the folder Barbara had carried into the hospital room and the way Ryan had stood at the window without looking at me. The pieces fit together too cleanly to be coincidence. They had been preparing this before the test results came back. The health scare had simply given them a convenient reason to move faster. I spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table sorting the statements Jessica had brought. Every page added another layer I had missed. Ryan had told me the brokerage was struggling with slower sales and higher overhead. The statements showed the business had been generating enough cash to support the transfers. He had not been struggling. He had been redirecting money into an account his mother controlled. I could not yet see the full reason, but the pattern was clear enough. He had been building an exit while telling me we were building a life. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was Barbara. I answered, because I wanted to hear what she would say now that I had seen the letter. Her voice was brisk, almost cheerful, as if the conversation in the hospital had never happened. She asked whether I had signed the papers yet. When I said I had not, she sighed in the way she did when she believed someone was being deliberately difficult. She told me Ryan was under a great deal of stress and that dragging things out would only make it harder for everyone. She mentioned that the law firm handling the separation had already prepared a draft of the asset division. She said it would be simpler if I agreed to the terms they had outlined rather than forcing them to involve outside auditors. I asked her what auditors she meant. She paused for half a second before answering that the brokerage kept clean books and there was no reason to complicate a private matter with unnecessary reviews. The pause told me more than the words. I thanked her for the call and hung up before she could say anything else. My hands were steady when I set the phone down, but the cold feeling in my chest had spread. That afternoon, I drove to the bank where I worked. I did not go to my desk. I went straight to the small office of Thomas Reed, the senior auditor who handled compliance reviews for commercial accounts. Thomas and I had worked on a few overlapping files over the years. He was precise and quiet, the kind of person who noticed discrepancies without needing to be told where to look. I asked him if he had time to review a set of statements from a small brokerage. I did not use Ryan's name. I said it was a personal matter and that I needed an outside opinion on whether the cash flows looked consistent with the reported income. Thomas took the pages I had copied from Jessica's file. He scanned them without comment for several minutes. Then he pointed to the same series of transfers Jessica had flagged. He said the pattern suggested funds were being moved to avoid showing as business income. He asked whether the brokerage had undergone any recent audits or whether the owner had filed amended returns. I told him I did not know. He nodded and said that if I wanted a formal review, he could request one through proper channels, but it would take time and would likely trigger questions from the brokerage's own accountants. I thanked him and left the copies with him. He promised to call if anything stood out after he had more time to look. On the drive home, I kept the radio off. The city moved around me in its usual late afternoon rhythm, but I felt detached from it, as if I were watching everything through glass. When I pulled into the driveway, Ryan's car was parked in its usual spot. The lights were on in the living room. I sat in my own car for a moment, the engine still running, and considered turning around. Then I shut off the ignition and walked inside. Ryan was in the kitchen pouring a drink. He looked up when I came through the door but did not move toward me. He asked how I was feeling after the hospital. I told him the results were clear. He nodded, as if that settled something. Then he said we needed to talk about the papers. His voice was calm, almost reasonable, the same tone he used when he explained a deal that had gone sideways. He said his mother had been trying to help by bringing everything at once. He said he had not wanted to add more stress while I was waiting for test results. He said the letter he had sent was meant to give me time to think. I asked him about the trust in his mother's name. He set the glass down. For the first time since the hospital, he met my eyes directly. He said the trust was an old arrangement his uncle had set up before he died, and that it had nothing to do with our marriage. He said the transfers were loans to help his mother cover some unexpected expenses on one of the family properties. He said he had planned to tell me once the brokerage stabilized. The explanation was smooth and practiced. It did not match the dates on the statements or the letter he had written 2 weeks earlier. I did not argue with him. I told him I needed time to read through everything, and that I would not sign anything until I understood the full picture. He accepted that without pushing further. He said he would stay at his parents' house again that night to give me space. Before he left, he placed a second copy of the separation agreement on the counter. He said his mother wanted me to have it in case the first one had been misplaced. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him, with the same soft click I had heard in the hospital room. I stood in the kitchen until the sound of his car faded down the street. Then I picked up the new copy of the agreement and carried it to the desk where the laptop still sat open. I placed it next to the envelope with Ryan's letter. The 2 documents looked ordinary, the kind of paperwork any couple might exchange during a difficult conversation. They did not look like the end of a marriage that had started with ordinary hopes. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Thomas Reed. He had reviewed the statements more carefully and wanted to meet the next morning. He said one of the property addresses linked to the trust appeared in a recent county filing that did not match the brokerage's public records. He did not explain further in the text. He simply asked what time worked for me. I typed back that I would be there at 9. Then I turned off the phone and sat in the dark living room. The envelope with Ryan's letter rested on the coffee table. I had not thrown it away. I had not opened it again either. Somewhere in the quiet, I understood that the letter was not the last piece. It was only the first one I had been meant to see. The rest was still coming piece by piece, and I was no longer waiting for anyone else to decide when I was ready to look. The next morning, I met Thomas Reed at his office exactly at 9. He had already printed additional records and spread them across his desk in neat rows. He did not waste time with small talk. He pointed to a series of property transfers that linked the trust in Barbara's name to a commercial building Ryan's brokerage had sold the previous year. The sale price on the public record was lower than the amount that had moved through the trust account. Thomas said the difference suggested the brokerage had understated the profit on its books. If the IRS or the State Real Estate Commission ever reviewed the transaction, the discrepancy would require an explanation that did not appear to exist in the files. I asked him what would happen next. Thomas said he could not open a formal audit without a client request or a regulatory trigger, but he could flag the pattern internally and recommend a compliance review. He asked whether I wanted him to proceed. I told him I needed 24 hours to decide. He nodded and said the window for quiet resolution was closing. Once an external agency became involved, the process would move on its own timeline, regardless of what either of us wanted. I thanked him and left with copies of the new pages folded inside my bag. On the way home, I stopped at a small law office I had found online the night before. Mark Sullivan had been recommended in a quiet forum for people navigating private separations without public spectacle. He was in his late 40s, spoke in measured sentences, and did not ask why I had waited so long to seek advice. I placed the separation agreement and the statements from Jessica on his desk. He read them without comment for several minutes. Then he asked whether I had any documentation showing I had contributed to the assets listed in the agreement. I told him most of the joint accounts were funded from my salary. He made a note and said that fact would matter when we responded to the draft. Mark asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to understand the full extent of what Ryan and Barbara had moved before I agreed to anything. He said he could send a formal request for complete financial disclosure, but it would likely accelerate the conflict. He also said that if I chose not to sign the current draft, I should prepare for the possibility that Barbara would use the health scare as part of a narrative about my capacity to manage my own affairs. He did not soften the words. He simply stated the risk and waited for my answer. I told him to send the request. Before I left his office, he handed me a single sheet with his contact information and a short list of next steps. One item on the list read, "Consider temporary no-contact order if pressure escalates." I folded the paper and put it in my bag with the statements. On the drive home, the city felt smaller than it had the day before, as if every familiar street now led back to the same set of questions. Ryan was waiting in the living room when I returned. Barbara sat beside him on the sofa. She had brought a fresh copy of the separation agreement and a pen. Edward, Ryan's father, stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He did not speak when I entered. Barbara opened the folder and placed it on the coffee table between us. She said the family had given me enough time. She said Ryan's reputation at the brokerage could not withstand a prolonged dispute. She said the health scare had already created enough gossip among their friends, and that further delay would only damage everyone involved. Her voice remained even almost kind, the same tone she had used in the hospital. She slid the pen across the table and told me to sign the pages where the tabs indicated. I did not pick up the pen. I asked her about the trust and the transfers Thomas Reed had shown me. Barbara's expression did not change. She said those arrangements were family matters that predated my marriage and had nothing to do with the current discussion. Ryan looked at the floor. Edward remained silent by the door. I placed the copies I had received from Thomas on the table beside the agreement. I told them the discrepancies would be difficult to explain if anyone outside the family examined the brokerage's books. Barbara's hand tightened on the edge of the folder for half a second before she released it. She said I was mistaken about what I had seen, and that pursuing the matter would only hurt Ryan's ability to provide for himself after the separation. She said the family had already decided what was best, and that my refusal to accept it was selfish. Ryan finally spoke. He said he had tried to protect me from the details while I was dealing with the health scare. He said the transfers were temporary, and that everything would be settled once the separation was final. His voice was tired rather than angry. He asked me to sign so we could both move forward without more damage. I stood up. I told them I would not sign anything until I had complete and verified financial disclosure from both the brokerage and the trust. I said I would be staying in the house until the legal process determined otherwise, and that I expected Ryan to respect that boundary. Barbara started to speak again, but I continued before she could finish. I said any further discussion about my health or my capacity would happen through lawyers only. I asked them to leave. Edward was the first to move. He opened the front door without looking at me. Barbara gathered the folder slowly, as if she was still deciding whether to press further. Ryan followed her. Before he stepped outside, he turned back and said my name once quietly. I did not answer. The door closed behind them. That evening, Jessica texted me. She said she had received a call from her compliance department asking why she had accessed certain records outside her normal client list. She said she could not continue to help directly without risking her own position. She apologized and wished me well. I replied that I understood. After I sent the message, I deleted the thread. The silence that followed felt heavier than the argument in the living room. Over the next week, Mark Sullivan filed the request for full disclosure. Thomas Reed's internal flag triggered a limited compliance review at the brokerage. The review did not become a full audit immediately, but the questions it raised forced Ryan to produce documentation he had not previously shared. The discrepancies grew harder to explain. Barbara stopped calling. Ryan moved the rest of his belongings to his parents' house without another conversation. The house felt larger and quieter with each day that passed. One afternoon, a second envelope arrived, this one delivered by courier rather than mail. It contained a single typed letter on Barbara's personal stationery. The date on it was 3 weeks before my health scare. In it, she wrote to Ryan that the separation needed to happen soon because the trust arrangements could not remain hidden indefinitely. She wrote that my health issues, whatever they turned out to be, provided the cleanest reason to end the marriage without raising questions about the money. She ended by saying she would handle the paperwork if he could not bring himself to do it. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it inside the folder with the other documents and carried the folder to Mark Sullivan's office. He read it without comment and added it to the file he was building. He said the letter would not decide the case on its own, but it changed the context of every demand they had made. I nodded and asked what came next. He said the process would be slow and that I should prepare for periods of silence followed by sudden pressure. He asked whether I still wanted to stay in the house. I told him yes. He made another note and said we would proceed one step at a time. Months later, the legal separation was finalized on terms closer to equal division than the original draft had proposed. The brokerage review continued without a full public audit, but Ryan's ability to operate without scrutiny had ended. Barbara and Edward withdrew from any direct contact. Jessica sent one final message wishing me well and asking that I not reach out again while the compliance questions remained open. I respected the request. I stayed in the house because it was the only place that still felt like mine. The rooms were the same, yet the quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of waiting for someone else to return. It was the silence of a life I had chosen to protect, even when the cost was the loss of every person who had once filled it. Some evenings, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents closed beside me and let the stillness settle. The fear that had accompanied the health scare had long since passed. What remained was something quieter and more permanent, the knowledge that I had refused to sign away my own story when every person I trusted had asked me to do exactly that. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel broken. I felt the particular emptiness that comes after you have drawn a line and discovered that almost no one on the other side of it is willing to cross back. The peace that arrived with the boundaries was real, but it arrived alone. I had chosen myself without guilt. The price of that choice was a solitude I had not fully imagined when I first refused to pick up the pen. Thank you for listening to my story. If you were standing where I was with the people closest to you rewriting your story to fit their exit, would you have signed the papers to keep the peace, or would you have chosen the uncertainty of starting over alone?